We've spent a bunch of time talking about the different things that you can do with TDD. And in particular, the big difference compared to the cucumber scenarios that we were thinking of previously as integration level or acceptance level tests. Not only is TDD more fine-grained, now we're looking at the implementations of specific methods, but because of that, there's all these facilities to really carefully control the code paths that you're going through when you're testing so that you can really isolate and test each behavior of interest. So you can stub a method and return a canned value to maybe, force a conditional to go a certain way. You can create mock objects that, you sort of need a stunt double to stand in so the code can run, but it doesn't really matter what else that object does because that's not what the test is about. So all of these facilities that exist so that you can sort of, very carefully zoom in on a specific behavior and make sure that you're testing exactly that behavior. And a thing that took me a while to realize as I began to get in the habit of doing that myself is that these are actually all the same things that you do when you write code the old way. And for me, the old way is you write a few lines, you sort of assume that they'll work, but of course they won't. And so you spend some time with the debugger trying to figure out how to make them work. So, if we think about TDD versus what I call conventional debugging, right? The old way of doing things. In the old way of doing things, we would, write a few lines of code. We would try to run them and they wouldn't work. So then we would sort of probably fire up the debugger. Maybe we would put in some print statements so that at key points in the code, we could verify what the values of, let's say, certain variables were and figure out what's the first point where it went wrong. Maybe if we're trying to test a particular code path, we would stop in the debugger, modify the values of some variables, and then continue in order to force the code to sort of go a certain way. And even when you think you've done all that and you fixed it, and then you try again, you didn't really fix it. And now you have to manually go through and do all those things one more time. So, in TDD, you write a few lines, but you're writing them at the same time of the test. So ideally, you know immediately if something is broken. And if you're using a tool like Guard, which I mentioned last time, each time you're saving your files, other tests that might be related to them are also being run automatically. So if you break anything, you sort of get an immediate heads up before it's too late to figure out, okay, what's the last thing I did that broke that? Like that was working before. Inserting print statements to print variables, well, in TDD, the sort of equivalent of that is an expectation, right? If you stop in the debugger and you print a variable, it's because you're looking to see whether it has some value. If you capture that in an expectation, you'll just see an error message, expected X to be 5 and it was 6 or whatever the message might be. When you're stopping on the debugger and trying to sort of play around with variable values to force the code to go a certain way, that's basically using mocks and method stubs to sort of determine the code path, right? Create fake objects that have just enough behavior, stub certain methods and make them return a predictable canned result. And that's what we call seams, right? Places where you can modify the behavior of the app's code without actually changing the source code in place. And of course, if you do all those things and you still haven't fixed the bug, at least rerunning the test is really simple. You just sort of push the button and run it again. So, for me, the first lesson is all of the same skills and things that you need to know when you're doing old school debugging. Those are the same ones that you put in place when you're doing TDD, but TDD ends up being a lot more productive. You get better test coverage, you get to do all of the same things, and you're essentially automating some of the steps that you would have done manually if you were doing conventional debugging. And the other lesson, I guess, is that especially when you're getting started doing this, it feels weird. And it feels like it takes more time to write the test with or before the code, as opposed to what most of us were used to, which is writing the code first and then sort of as an afterthought writing the tests. It does take more time as you start to do it, but it gets easier fast. And it often takes less time overall because the extra time you're spending in thinking about writing the code this way is paid back because the, rerunning the test and always having that coverage there, you sort of get those things for free. Indeed, I keep showing you these top 10 slides. The number 4 top 10 on the top 10 list of advice from students who took the class previously. TDD is hard at first, but it gets easier. It was great for quickly noticing bugs because since your test suite just sort of grows over time, and as soon as you break something, your test suite will tell you right away. Helped organize thoughts as well as code. And I think this is a reference to what I've been calling the code you wish you had. Forcing you to think about how to exercise that code if it existed, gives you sort of testability for free, but it also organizes your code better. For students who, didn't really commit to doing this, they wish that they had committed to it earlier and been sort of more invested in it. And in particular, that the students that didn't always do testing before they push. As we'll learn when we start talking about teamwork and organizing work in a team, and certainly if you go on to take 169L, it is a fact of life today that when you push code, tests automatically run. That's just the way the world is. And for the most part, there shouldn't be any surprises when that happens because you've been testing the code as you've been developing it too. But the idea, testing is this shield that is always on. And the minute somebody breaks something, you sort of know about it as quickly as possible. Students that didn't do the testing before pushing were in a lot of pain. We're going to talk a little bit today about test coverage and code quality. But again, there's automated tools that every time you push, not only does it run all of your tests, but it will capture various metrics about what fraction of the app functionality is being exercised by different kinds of tests. Today, we'll talk about how you measure some of those things. But having good test coverage gave confidence that when we deployed new code, we weren't breaking something else. Code climate is a tool we use extensively in 169L. It's kind of like a very high-level linter. It finds design issues and code smells, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. And it sort of gives you a GPA. It gives every file in your project a grade, and then it computes your GPA based on the grade. And it's sort of very easy to spot which files have ugly code in them, right? This is very much about high maintainability. So getting a high grade from code climate and having high test coverage makes you feel really good, because what that's saying is you're putting the next person who comes after you in a really good place to take over the project and add value to it. When we talk about teamwork, one of the sort of patterns that has become very common to follow is the way you integrate your code is you open a pull request that essentially should trigger a review by one or more people on your team to sort of have multiple eyeballs on the code before it gets merged in. And that model essentially results in constant code reviews. So it gave the team confidence that the overall code quality remained high, even though lots of different people were committing. And again, the teams that didn't commit to sort of having a good testing plan, having coverage measurement that was in place every time they checked code in, they basically ended up wishing they had. So that's a few thoughts about the new way versus the old way. I think the lesson here is have a little bit of faith, and even though it feels weird when you first start doing this, the benefits are paid back really quite soon.